Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar brought to you in partnership with Hive Learning. My name is Kath Longfield and I'm a co-founder of the Business Culture Awards and Events. As you know, this webinar plus another which is scheduled for next Thursday were originally going to be a D&I breakfast meeting taking place in London today. But wherever we happen to be in the world, we now find ourselves living and working through incredibly challenging circumstances and unprecedented change. So we thank you wholeheartedly for joining us today, despite all that's going on around us, and thank goodness for technology for enabling us to connect. So on to today's subject. When we first launched these awards, it was never just about one-off recognition. It was about creating a community that shared organisational challenges and enabled people to learn from one another's work. Hence this webinar and the wide variety of events that we now run. And of course that we're now either running virtually or later on in the year. We're very grateful to our speakers for sharing their approaches and particularly for turning what was planned to be a face-to-face event into a virtual one at such short notice. So we know that culture is one of the top 5 reasons people choose to join an employer. It's also why they stay. We're already into year 5 of recognising the most outstanding efforts to align our people and culture with the strategy of our businesses. And you can see the celebration of this here. So today we're sharing the case study of this year's Diversity and Inclusion Award winner. I'm delighted to have Philip Wilson joining us from the Civil Service Fast Stream, along with a key partner he worked with on the programme, Felicity Carter from Ambitious About Autism, and James Lodge, one of the participants on the programme. Phil, could I ask you to introduce the team, as it were?
Of course. Thank you so much, and it's a delight to join everybody in these slightly strange circumstances of the lockdown, but we will be fine, I'm sure, and the main thing is everybody's safe. That's critical. So we've got, yes, my colleagues. I'm Phil Wilson, Head of Assessment and Diversity at the Civil Service Fast Stream, which is a graduate employer in the civil service. And we also have Felicity, who is the project manager for this work that we undertook with Ambitious About Autism. And it's been a relationship we've had for a number of years now. And also James Lodge, really pleased to have James on board. James is a former intern from the programme last year and looking forward to hearing his insight as well. He's currently now at HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs.
Brilliant, many thanks, Phil. And we're also joined by Fiona Young from Hive Learning, a company who launched the world's first digital inclusion toolkit and who help organisations to be more inclusive every day. Welcome, Fiona, and could you say a few words to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Kath. Yes, of course. So I'm content director and I also lead the diversity and inclusion practice at Hive Learning, which is a peer learning app for enterprises. And on the side, I also host the Inclusion Works podcast. So definitely check that one out. So for us as a learning business, content means really building digital learning programs. So my team and I are focused on building really modern, straight talking content that gets people to change their behaviors and build new habits in areas like inclusion, leadership, well-being, resilience, innovation, etc. All sorts of things that we particularly need right now, I think. So after Phil, Felicity, and James's presentation, I'll be sharing some interesting research on unconscious bias training and how to do it better, really how to get everyone in your organization to examine their biases, to take action to sidestep them, and also to be more inclusive, just more broadly. So thank you, Kath, very much looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Fiona. So over the next 45 minutes, we'll learn more about accessing diverse talent effectively to build organisation-wide diversity, and also how we can encourage these increasingly positive, inclusive behaviours and make them a daily habit. If you've got any comments or questions as we go along, we'd love to hear them. So please just type them into your Q&A and we'll cover them at the end of each presentation. So I'm delighted to hand over to Phil, Felicity and James to present the Civil Services award-winning Diversity and Inclusion Programme. Phil.
Thank you so much indeed. Thanks, Kath. So let's start. Maybe if we could move on to the next slide, please. And yep, And that is just a sort of image to give you a taste of some of our participants and a few others who are supporting the program. That's from the year before last, actually 2018, and that was our closing reception. That's in my living room. No, it's not. No, it's not in my living room at all. It's a wonderful government building, and we were really pleased with that program, and it's flourished since then. And I'll give you a bit more insight as we go through. Okay, and next slide, please. So what we'll cover is something about autism. I'll hand over to Felicity to do that, and also a bit about the agency Ambitious About Autism and what they're doing with this program. Then I'll touch on our civil service program and bring in James as well, James Lodge, our intern, and give you a bit more insight into feedback and outcomes and how we support people in the workplace. And Felicity will cover some of that. We hope that it will be practical and give you some ideas about perhaps introducing something similar in your own organizations. Okay, over to Felicity. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Phil. So I want to tell you a little bit more about autism and what some of those barriers that autistic people face when trying to enter the job market. So autism is a lifelong developmental disability which affects around 1 in 100 people in the UK. It is an invisible condition, so you can't look at somebody and know if they're autistic or not. But what we talk around is the 4 areas of difference that somebody with autism might have. So that will be differences in the way they communicate, or it could be differences in interaction, understanding unwritten social rules, and it can also be differences with social imagination and sensory differences too. So that can mean that somebody is either over or undersensitive to any one or multiple senses. It is a spectrum condition, and everyone with autism will have a different experience and skill set and support needs as well. And it might not always be immediately obvious what those needs are or what that skill set is. I'm sure most of you have already heard in the past that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Everyone is entirely unique. And it's just as important to remember that in the workplace as well. And don't make assumptions around what somebody can or can't do just as well. Ultimately, we think of autism as a different way of thinking and processing information. And that different way of thinking can be absolutely fantastic for business and bring about more interesting ideas and solutions to problems. But first of all, we must understand those differences to make sure that we can support autistic people to thrive in the workplace. Next. So very few autistic people access education beyond school. And that can have a big impact because it can mean that somebody might miss out on the work experience which is made available through school. It can also mean that young autistic people might miss out on really good, meaningful careers advice as well. So when you're thinking about recruitment, it's really important to consider those less traditional academic pathways and evaluate somebody on their skill set, because somebody might not have been able to access university, but they could be completely self-taught in their area of special interest. So it's thinking a bit more flexibly around recruitment is really important. Next. So one reason we've identified that young people with autism might struggle to transition out of education and into employment is lack of good careers advice. And that could be poor careers advice or simply none at all. And careers advice is really important and plays a crucial role in helping autistic students determine their next step. So that's something we've built into the Autism Exchange programme. Thank you. Next. So this is the key statistic that I bang on about a lot, and it's something we're really trying to change. So only 16% of adults with autism are in full-time paid employment. That increases to 32% for any kind of paid work. And it's one of the lowest rates of employment across all different disabilities. And this can be because of the barriers to securing a role, so interview processes, but also once somebody's in a role as well and maintaining that employment. And the barriers start right at the very beginning. So we use lots of jargon on job descriptions very commonly. It could be a fact that adjustments are not offered or provided at interview stage, or once somebody is in work, those adjustments that were initially agreed might tail off and not be consistently implemented throughout someone's employment life cycle. Next. So around 1 in 100 people in the UK are autistic. It's much more well diagnosed in boys rather than girls. So about 4 times as many boys get a diagnosis than girls do. That's not to say there are more autistic boys out there, it's just we're better at diagnosing boys. It is changing. We see a lot more women getting a diagnosis later in life, so in their 40s, when they might recognise similar traits with their child is going through a diagnosis. So autism isn't new. It's been around for a really long time. We're just getting better at recognising it and recognising that there's different support mechanisms we can implement to improve the outcomes. Next. So about 6 years ago, we have a youth council who are 15 young people from across the UK who meet on a regular basis to discuss what's important to them as young autistic people. So about 6 years ago, they said, employment, please can we do something around employment? And their idea was to create an exchange of experience, hence Autism Exchange. So the idea was that young people with autism will have access to meaningful, paid work experience placements, and managers at the same time receive training to understand autism more generally and support from ourselves as a charity so they can understand more about what they can do differently as line managers, as colleagues, to better meet the needs of individuals with autism, how they can adapt their recruitment practices to get the best out of somebody. And I think that's very important because one of the key findings is that 60% of employers worry about getting support wrong. So having us there as a charity to offer that support and training throughout a placement, this increases confidence of line managers to employ more people with autism. Another outcome of the programme is all about increasing the confidence of autistic people as well, to advocate for themselves in terms of recognising what adjustments they might want to ask for, what they can ask for, and what they might need as well. So the idea is increasing employability skills through actual work, but also when somebody moves on into permanent employment, what they can ask for. Thank you. Next. So civil service is our key partner and our original partner, and Phil will talk a bit more about how the programme works there. But since then, we've used the civil service placements as a case study to promote the programme into other businesses as well. And as you can see from some of the employers we've worked with, it's a really diverse range of industries and sectors, and not just the traditionally stereotypical roles in the tech sector, which are very common for autistic people to be pigeonholed into, but we work with media agencies, creative agencies, and often we find that those roles which are in the creative sectors tend to have much higher uptake and interest in applicants for roles. So it's really important that we look beyond the stereotypes and make sure we offer all types of roles to autistic people because they want to work everywhere. Next, back to you, Phil.
Great, thank you so much. Just a few highlights from our programme, the Civil Service Autism Exchange Internship Programme. So next, please. This is a quick quote. I think that's really important to recognise that we can't expect every person with autism to necessarily display huge capability, but we want to recognise and value the different qualities that everybody brings and really embrace those qualities for the organisation. Next, please. The drivers for undertaking the programme were about hoping to upskill the people with autism, the young people, to develop mutual learning. So the interns would certainly benefit a great deal from the programme, but also, of course, the organisation would also benefit and learn a great deal, and that's been proven to be the case We wanted to offer coaching, career coaching to the interns, embrace neurodiversity. In other words, rather than focus on deficit, we wanted to focus on difference and strengths within those on the autism spectrum. We offered light touch work experience, wanted to get people understanding the nature of the workplace and hopefully improve employability. Next, please. And the elements were to do with raising awareness. So we offered autism awareness training to our managers, which were very well received. And in addition, an introductory session for all the participants, the interns, the managers and others, to offer the work experience, to offer one-to-one coaching skills sessions around selection skills, networking skills, and also celebrate the program and look at the way forward, the next steps. Next, please. And this is our portal with Ambitious About Autism, so that people who want to register would simply go to the homepage, register, and we would then hopefully take them on board and match them to the opportunities in the civil service. Next, please. And we've had a growing number of opportunities, in fact, going from just a handful in 2015 to this year, about 70 opportunities. We may well have to postpone the programme into the later part of this year, but nevertheless, we are really positive and buoyant about the number of bids that we've received for the internship. Next, please. And here's some of our wonderful interns. This is from last year. This is some engagement that we did at a particular event. And one of the people there is, in fact, James. So handing over to James, please. Next slide. Thanks a lot, James. Please do give us your insights as an intern. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Good afternoon, everyone. As an internee, I worked in the Department for Government Property within the Treasury, based in London. The work I did was varied. I worked within, my line manager worked within teams. I worked at a building in Victoria, working with other people to understand the use of a government initiative called Places for Growth, which is to encourage more jobs of the civil service to come out of London to other cities in the United Kingdom, such as Belfast, Sheffield and Birmingham. And with that, I analysed data for the reasons why they should move jobs out of London, which was a really positive experience, working alongside my line manager and working alongside Phil and Felicity with Ambitious About Autism. It provided me a stepping stone to my master's, which I started in September last year at Coventry, doing sport management. I developed my skills with Excel, teamwork, time management, and adapting to new scenarios. It was an amazing experience, and it provided me a lot of comfort that there are people out there that believe autism is an important strategy to have in the workplace. And during the time there, I had one-to-one coaching, meeting the fellow internees during the 3 weeks for the opening conference, the closing conference, and for a tour around Houses of Parliament and the House of Commons. I appreciate the opportunity I had, and it provided me the chance to work at HMRC, which I started in January this year, working as the first person on the workplace programme for autism, with my job role working at documents and making sure they are corrected for people with autism, and that people within the workplace that may not understand autism understand, and they have a clarification of what is required to make sure people on the autistic spectrum feel comfortable, relaxed, and feel that they will be part of the future in terms of neurodiversity. It was an honour to work at HMRC, and I'm still doing now. It's an amazing place to be, and the time that I had within the civil service was a fantastic experience, and with the skills that I've gained, as I mentioned before, and hopefully with my graduation of my master's degree and my undergraduate degree, I hope to go on to work on the fast stream program in the civil service very soon. Thank you for listening. Next.
Thank you so much, James, and thanks very much for your insights, and congratulations on your HMRC role. In terms of feedback, just a few highlights from participant feedback. We had 100% of the interns say they would recommend the program, and also 100% of said their line manager understood their autism and provided support. So it was a really positive experience. And just one other stat, 92% reported knowing a lot more about the civil service following the placement compared to just 38% at the start. So a real uplift there, that they were able to learn a lot more about the civil service through the placement. Next, please. And some of the other sort of bits of feedback were that it was felt to be energizing or inspiring. And go on to the next slide. And this is another statement. I was able to put my skills in research and analysis to great use. So again, really positive reception. And next. And the managers also, 100% reported an increase in understanding of autism, and 94% felt more confident in supporting somebody with autism. Next. And this is our key stat, really, that 84% of those who went on the programme had some sort of opportunity, a job role, either in the civil service or outside the civil service, or a study opportunity. So really positive engagement figures. And one of the schemes that we've now set up is indeed the HMRC program that James was describing. Thank you. Next, please. Okay, and we've had recognition. There's a wonderful picture of myself with colleagues and the people who were involved in the awards. And we've been delighted about the recognition that we've received. And next. And here's some tips. Over to Felicity, please.
Thanks, Phil. So here are some things that you can start thinking about immediately when you go back to your office or your new office at your dining table. Some immediate tips you can take away. So thinking around making adjustments that people request and actually implementing them and maintaining them is really important. They help people to carry on with their job and do the best they can do. Having regular meetings is really key to see how things are going, and that can be formal for line managers, but also informal catch-ups are just as important. And that's something I'm learning with my team at the moment with our new ways of working. It's really important to have like a coffee catch-up in the morning, let's say at 9:30 with one or two of your colleagues, just to see how things are. And it can be completely informal, as important as a formal catch-up is. Thinking about job descriptions, try not to use jargon and consider how important all the essential skills truly are. An example I see all the time is that good communication is on almost every single job description as an essential. Now, is good communication truly required to do that job, or is it just good written communication is vital? So thinking about a bit more literally about the language that you use is important. Acronyms, every single industry will have a whole set of acronyms that people should be aware of. So creating almost a Bible of all these different acronyms which you use can be really helpful for people to reflect on. And something that we've learned actually is to include common idioms or sayings that your team might use on a regular basis. So something that we've included in one of our booklets is the ball's in your court, and having a little explanation about what that might actually mean. Explaining what unwritten rules there are in your office. So probably not such an issue at the moment, but thinking about dress down Fridays. If you have that in your office, it's quite important to explain what is acceptable as dress down Friday and what isn't. so what people can and can't do. Encourage people that you work with to ask questions in a way that they find most comfortable, whether that's written or verbally or via email. Next. So using someone's name to get their attention is important. Don't rely on body language to get somebody's attention. Explain what will happen and why. So using agendas can be really helpful for a lot of people with autism if you're going to have a meeting. And it can help somebody feel prepared that they're going to do the right thing in that meeting. It can be as simple as, we're going to discuss these 3 bullet points, or it can be much more detailed according to each individual. Speak and write in clear literal sentences, and back things up in writing if you've given verbal instructions. Likewise, if you are showing somebody how to do a task, model it first so they can see what you mean to carry out a certain task. And using visual information can be really helpful. And allowing extra time for information processing is really key. Some people, it will vary. An interview, for instance, people might have a longer process delay than at other times once they've got more comfortable with you. Being aware of sensory difference is very important, and allowing somebody to using self-calming strategies if they need to. And of course, deliver what you say you will, be on time. All these adjustments and supporting tips I've gone through would help anybody in the workplace, not just autism specific. And as a line manager, the best thing you can do is be a really good line manager. It's not rocket science. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Just to wrap up, there's so many benefits in terms of developing an inclusive workplace through this type of program. It shows commitment, of course, to D&I, to diversity and inclusion. It reduces any stigma about neurodivergence. Staff feel more safe and reassured about supporting neurodivergence. And it sort of encourages fairness generally by having this type of program, and obviously opens up the pool of talent for those who might otherwise not be reviewed as potential applicants and potential members of staff. And it hopefully retains staff and brings them in on a longer term basis. And we always need to remember that there is so much variation, and the autism spectrum is one example of that. Okay, next. And we're doing a few other things. We're making our program more regional, hopefully a longer experience. We are trying to fast track some of our interns through the selection process for graduates, and also looking at the age range that we apply. Thank you. And thank you so much. Back to Kath.
Well, thank you so much. That was really important and interesting insight with how you've launched this program and used it as a kind of launch pad for other organisations to get on board with Ambitious About Autism. So, you know, applause to you. We have got quite a number of questions that have come through. In the interest of time, we'll only be able to take a couple before moving on, but I will make sure that you know, we can get answers to the other questions, and certainly we'll be sending everybody here a link to this recording, and you'll also have a copy of the slides with that. So we have a question here which says, what sort of workplace adjustments did you find were being requested, from Wendy Ramshaw?
I think if I can just jump in, it would be things like offering a quiet space. That's really important, making sure that the intern is able to find some time just to collect their thoughts. And it would be also about making sure instructions are clear and clearly set out for the intern.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Phil, because a lot of the adjustments that we do find are requested are completely free. So it could be things like flexible working, having a quiet space, as Phil said. Thanks.
Thank you. And we have another comment. Out of interest, where the stats taken from, especially the 16% employment figure, and how current are these percentages? I mean, it just is astounding, isn't it, that only 16% of adults with autism are in kind of paid full-time employment?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly the National Autistic Society do use that statistic. Of course, it needs to be updated all the time. It may be that that changes somewhat. And if you have any more insight on that, Felicity?
Yep, so the 16% stat is from the National Autistic Society Mind the Gap employment report, which I think is about 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old now. So it is aging, but there is a lot of research currently ongoing via Autistica. They're doing a big project. So hopefully we'll have some newer stats coming through soon.
Great. Well, I think we will now thank our speaker. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and particularly James for sharing your insight in what it's like to join the workplace with autism, and it's brilliant that all of these opportunities are open to you in your future. So best of luck. And so I'm now going to hand over to Fiona Young, who's going to share her insight and research, as she said earlier, into unconscious bias training. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks so much again, Kath. So yeah, I'll spend just the next 5 minutes, really quick whiz through to share some research that we released earlier this month on how to do unconscious bias training better. And then we'll also have a little bit of time for Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function below to send those directly on to us. Next. So it probably won't surprise you that companies spend a lot of money every year running unconscious bias training. Seems to be sort of the standard starting point, right? Next. But it is surprising, just given that there's a huge ream of research that shows it's not effective. Particularly the standard face-to-face, one-off unconscious bias training has been shown to result in a backlash. It oftentimes can make people get defensive or even make them feel like they've been let off the hook, which is what psychologists sometimes call moral licensing. Or perhaps it's because it's just not practical enough, right? And that sort of one-off format doesn't give people the tools they need to change what they're doing day to day. Next. So we really set off to figure out why and how to do it better. And obviously we have a vested interest in this, given we're working in this space too. We interviewed 35 D&I leaders one-to-one, and those are people who were based primarily in the UK and the US, most of them in big corporates working on kind of a global basis. And then we also captured ideas from a further 50 D&I leaders in a series of roundtable events we hosted. So this is sort of learnings from about 85 different people. Next. So I think, ultimately, the essential truth that we need to acknowledge here is that we all have bias, right? This is a great quote from Iris Bonet. And actually, if you hadn't read her book, What Works, I would highly recommend it. We all have it. It's deep-seated, and thus it's exceptionally difficult to shift, even when we do become aware of it. And so, as she says, it takes continual effort. Next. So our first finding, I'm going to go through, sorry, I should have said, I'm going to go through 5 different findings from our report. Our first one was to de-bias talent practices. So you can't rely on people to spot and to sidestep their bias, kind of just bridging on from that quote from Iris Bonet. So don't just train people about their bias. Actually take it into account when you're designing talent practices. So things like hiring assessments or interviewing, or the way you're measuring performance, or the way you're making pay decisions. So for instance, in interviews, hiring managers should be wary of grazing on the small talk and instead ask each candidate the same question in the same order, right? So oftentimes that small talk surfaces some similar interests, it triggers our affinity bias, and it also takes precious time away from a really fair and equitable assessment of each candidate, particularly when you might connect with one a lot more than others. So next. Our second finding is that we need to sort of rebrand D&I training. So in other words, rather than having a standalone program, really make it a theme that cuts across all of your other programs. So several people we interviewed, of course, spoke about inclusion being part of leadership offsites and being a part of frontline manager training. Of course, we know that's a key part of being a great line manager. But we also heard some other really cool ideas. One leader we spoke to in financial services runs a program called Smarter Decisions. That's really about making meetings and decision-making processes more inclusive, to leverage that diversity of thought, and to ultimately come up with stronger, more innovative ideas. And actually, one thing that's great about it, as she said to us, is, this is a great way to get people on board with D&I who might not actually be yet, and to very subtly start to help them understand what inclusion really means and how to do it every day. And so there's just one other thing to mention here is the mandatory element, right? So mandatory training from the academic research that we've seen creates a lot of the issues I mentioned earlier, like backlash, defensiveness, etc. Actually, one of our clients who works in the media industry and has been on our digital inclusion toolkit for the past year told us that a couple years back they did an e-learning, like a traditional e-learning training on D&I, and they saw when it was mandatory they had a 26% completion rate, but then when they took on our digital inclusion toolkit, which was not mandatory, they found that 88% of their people consumed it all. So I think there's something as well here about sort of a pull, not a push approach. So make these programs something that people want to do, not something that they have to do. Next. So I think the third finding here is pretty self-explanatory, right? These tiny actions are key. Making it super simple, super concrete. Actually much of the stuff on how to be inclusive in your day-to-day really comes down to really tiny things, like how you're talking to people, how you're listening to others, how you're creating a psychologically safe environment, and really just making a conscious effort to be equitable. But ultimately don't leave people to guess what to do to practice this stuff, because most people are well-meaning, they're just clueless, they don't know how. And so our next finding actually goes hand in hand with this. Next. So nudging people on an ongoing basis is so key to changing behaviors and also making them stick. So of course, nudges are key to what we're doing in our digital inclusion toolkit and loads of other digital tools too. And I could probably fill a whole webinar on the science and practice of these, so I won't go too deep into it. But definitely my top tip here from my own work is to use a mix of nudges. So you want to nudge people towards taking practical actions. You want to nudge people towards reflection. You want to nudge people in a way to actually entertain them or surprise them or delight them, right? Kind of what I mentioned earlier about making this the learning that you want to do, not the learning that you have to do. So that's important too for learning. But there's loads of other ways to nudge outside of the digital tools. So I loved one idea I heard from a lady from UBS who we interviewed for our research. So they bring a big jar of jelly beans into their hiring assessment meetings with a sign on it that says, "Do you always pick the same one?" And I just thought that was so clever, right? It's such a clever way to interrupt bias and to nudge in those moments that matter. Next. So our fifth final finding, this I'm sure will not surprise anyone here, is around accountability. It was interesting, we heard some very different views and quite contentious debate on this. For instance, whether you really want to assess how inclusive leaders are and tie their bonuses to this metric. I know that's always a very controversial one. Some people say this sort of thing is too hard-nosed, or that it reduces D&I to just another target to hit. One person we interviewed was convinced that the key to accountability is actually getting people to deeply understand the why, because then they'll hold themselves accountable. And actually that's a much more sustainable way of driving accountability. So I thought that was quite interesting. Next. So just to wrap up, so of the D&I leaders we spoke to, 69% felt that unconscious bias training still has a place at work, but that it only has a positive impact when it's coupled with other initiatives. And also delivered well, right? So in a way that's really human, with a focus on storytelling. Of course, it could be a powerful tool in helping people understand the why. Next. But interestingly, not a single one of the leaders we spoke to felt that unconscious bias training was effective at driving lasting behavior change. And so that, I think, really says it all. So that's all I have for you just on our report. And of course, we'll share the report, and also we'll share some details with everyone about our Inclusion Works Leaders Network, which is a free digital community that we host for D&I leaders and practitioners to connect, to support each other and share best practices. And of course, next slide, I would love to connect with you as well to share more and help you with your D&I learning challenges if I can. So feel free to drop me a line, and thank you, and on to questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Fiona. That was a really thought-provoking presentation. And I just found it was full of really practical tips that people could apply, right down to that really interesting one about the jelly bean jar. I think just really bringing it home to people what they can do practically. So I know you spent, within Hive Learning, a great deal of time researching D&I best practice, I think since about 2007, is that right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the more surprising things you've discovered along the way?
Oh, that's such a great question. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey the past couple of years, and we've talked to hundreds of people and consulted literally thousands of sources for this program, and I have learned so much. So to try to kind of distill it down to a few interesting things, I think the first one, you know, working in tech, right, being kind of, I've worked for the last 10 years in digital learning, L&D. I was just shocked how not digital this world is, right? And we've worked with some brilliant partners in D&I who are doing amazing work. And it's a shame that this world is still so driven by face-to-face. And of course, right now with coronavirus, this actually is a serious issue, and how to scale this stuff and how to push it out on a big scale. So that's something I would say was really surprising. One piece of the program was sort of inspired by a surprising discovery, actually. We work agile in our teams. This is a great example of why agile is so important. In the process of testing, researching, pushing out this content, testing it on real people, I found that we had this big gaping hole in what we built, which was actually putting a glossary in there. And this is so typical because, of course, you know, my team and I are like, we are digital D&I learning program people. This is what we think about. This is what we eat, sleep, dream, you know, and we didn't realize, like, this is such a barrier. No one knows the words to use to talk about this stuff. And so we created a whole toolkit around some of the kind of ground rules for how to have a conversation about D&I, some of the actual words to use when you're talking about race, about ethnicity, you know, disability, all sorts of areas that are like, you know, people don't like to talk about. And I was just shocked by the fact that we had missed it, but also just what a pain point that was for learners. And yeah, so I'd say those are two. I feel like I could probably talk for 10 minutes about this, but conscious of everyone's time.
Yes, sorry about this. You know, I'm really appreciative that you're managing to boil down, you know, sort of acres of research into, you know, a very, very short time. And, you know, another question that we've just had come up is, what would you answer to those who say there's no fast route to creating inclusion and collaboration at scale? It's just something that really is a slog, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I think that there is no quick route to it. And what we're trying to do really through digital, you know, is to speed that up. And I think there's a couple things we've learned in the process that I would share is that it is so important, especially for that accountability point, so important to get people together for this stuff. There's nothing worse than lonely learning. There's nothing worse than an e-learning program where you can't talk to people and have a conversation and share ideas and stories. And that is ultimately, you know, what you get. The great thing about a face-to-face session is all of that collaboration. And that's what we're trying to really achieve digitally, is bringing people together behind that kind of really purpose-driven community. So, and I would also say as well that it is such long-term work that one thing I've learned along the way is a lot of the folks that I know in working in these D&I roles, like many of you on this webinar, I'm sure, really struggle with burnout and with diversity fatigue themselves, because this is hard work, right? And we need to look after ourselves too. And I think, you know, this is particularly top of mind right now as we're going through such an upheaval of change given COVID-19. And so, yeah, I think we have to be realistic about what we can achieve. But I think as well, when you get people together and get people sharing, you'd be amazed at how much of a movement you can drive with learning like this.
Thank you, Fiona. That's fantastic. And you know, particularly to know, because I get all the time through the awards and through the events, people asking me how they can connect with others who are doing the best work, but also others at an earlier stage of the journey as they are. So just the fact that there is this platform that people can meet digitally, I think it, you know, particularly at the moment, is really, really important. So thank you so much. So I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I hope you found the session useful. I've personally found it really insightful to hear all of our speakers. So thank you all so much. And I'd like to thank Hive Learning for working with us as our D&I partner. And just mentioning as well, the webinar recording will be available from tomorrow, and we'll email everybody a link to it, as well as those people who couldn't be with us today. Next. We're very aware that you've all got many pressing priorities at the moment as you direct and support people in your respective businesses. And, you know, at times like this, it seems impossible to consider any sort of celebration. But I believe as we come out of the other side of this awful situation, giving our teams a boost may be very much what they need. So with this in mind, we're at the moment open for award entries until the 19th of June. So if you have worked hard to create the sort of workplace where people can deliver at their best, then do consider requesting an entry pack on the website businesscultureawards.com. And as I mentioned, we've got two webinars. So we have our second and final one taking place next Thursday. So let us know if you haven't registered, if you're on the call today, you haven't registered but would like to attend, and we'll make sure that you receive a link to join that one. On this, we'll learn how the Financial Times has achieved gender parity through the organisation and evolved their D&I strategy in order to continue diversifying their customer base. And Priscilla Before, the global head of D&I for the Financial Times, will be sharing this case study. We were also due to run a one-day business culture conference in London on the 5th of May, with more than 25 senior practitioners who were all booked in to share their case studies and to take part in discussions. We've delayed that. It's going to take place at Lord's Cricket Ground on the 22nd of September, and hoping that, you know, we'll be good by then. We'd love you to join us, and there's more information again on the website. So once again, many thanks to everybody for joining us, and above all else, stay safe and stay well.